Welcome to our deep dive. Today we'll be looking into the case of Bobby Joe Long, a name that you might recognize if you're familiar with the Tampa Bay area.
Yeah, definitely a name that sends chills down your spine.
We're working with excerpts from his Wikipedia page, and you might be surprised to learn that this case, this Bobby Joe Long case, was really important in the development of forensic science, and particularly when it comes to fiber analysis.
That's true. It's crazy how something as tiny as a fiber can be such a big piece of the puzzle, especially back then when forensic science was just starting to really evolve. Before DNA was the gold standard, they really had to rely on things like fibers to connect those dots and figure out, who was where.
Right, it's like those old detective stories where the tiniest little clue ends up being the key. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's rewind back to the beginning. We know that Bobby Joe Long was active in the Tampa Bay area of Florida, and he had this really chilling nickname, the Classified Ad Rapist. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that all worked?
So Long would actually target women who would place classified ads, like selling household items or even trying to find roommates. He'd contact them, get into their homes, and then attack them. It's a really calculated strategy, taking advantage of people's trust.
It really is scary how premeditated it all seems. It makes you wonder, what could lead someone down such a dark path? Of course, it's never a simple answer. But looking into his early life, there are some things that maybe could give us a little insight.
Right. His childhood was pretty troubled by all accounts. He had a complex relationship with his mother, even sleeping in her bed until he was a teenager, which is pretty unusual.
And I also remember reading that he was born with Klinefelter syndrome. This is where a male is born with an extra X chromosome. And this can cause some differences in physical development. I think that also caused him some issues growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a major factor in the relentless teasing and bullying he faced throughout his childhood. You can only imagine how that constant humiliation could affect a young person's self-esteem, and it definitely makes you think about how those experiences might have shaped his later actions.
And it wasn't just the Klinefelter syndrome. I remember reading he also suffered multiple head injuries when he was young. So all of that together, the family dynamics, the genetic condition, the head injuries, it definitely paints a picture of a very tough childhood.
It does. And it's a question that criminologists still debate, how much of our behavior is predetermined and how much is shaped by our experiences. It's definitely something to think about as we delve deeper into this case.
Yeah, for sure. It's more questions than answers at this point, but it's important to consider all of that context. So let's move on to the crimes themselves. Long's reign of terror in Tampa Bay, it lasted from March to November of 1984, which was a really scary time for the community.
Yeah, it was 8 months of terror, basically. And during that time, he was linked to at least 10 murders, all women, all between the ages of 18 and 28.
That's awful. Each of those cases is a tragedy on its own, but one of the cases really stands out, not just because of the horror of the crime, but also because it offers a bit of hope and resilience. And this is actually where forensic science really comes into play.
Right, you're talking about Lisa McVeigh.
Exactly.
She was only 17 when Long abducted her, but amazingly, she managed to survive.
I know, it's an incredible story. And if I remember correctly, they ended up catching Long outside of a movie theater.
That's right, a movie theater of all places.
Can you walk us through how that all went down?
So Lisa McVeigh, despite going through 26 horrifying hours as his captive, she was able to think clearly enough to gather evidence, and she provided the police with a very detailed account of her ordeal. Even tiny things like her noticing that he used an ATM were critical in identifying him.
That's amazing how she could stay so focused under that kind of pressure.
Yeah, it really is. She left fingerprints in the bathroom, described his apartment and car. It's a testament to her strength and determination.
It's a good reminder that even in the worst situations, people can find a way to fight back.
I couldn't agree more. Her willingness to relive those awful memories to help the police, that undoubtedly played a huge part in stopping him.
Now, you mentioned that forensic science was important in this story. What specific evidence did they actually find that tied Long to these crimes?
So in addition to Lisa's testimony, there was one key piece of evidence, red carpet fibers. They found these fibers on several of the victims, and they matched fibers from Long's car.
Wow, it's crazy to think that something as simple as carpet fibers could solve a murder case.
It really shows how powerful, careful evidence collection can be, especially back then when forensic science wasn't as advanced as it is today.
So those tiny fibers, that was essentially Long's undoing. What happened after they arrested him?
Well, he actually confessed, but it wasn't without a bit of drama. Initially, he was cooperating, answering questions, but as they started focusing on the unsolved murders, he clammed up, saying, "I'd rather not answer that."
I can imagine that was a tense moment.
Oh, yeah. But the detectives didn't give up. They kept going, showed him pictures of the victims, and that's when he realized how serious things were. He famously said, "The complexion of things sure has changed since you came back into the room. I think I need an attorney."
Classic line. And you mentioned earlier that he didn't have an attorney at that point, so what happened next? Did he end up confessing?
He did. He confessed to 8 murders in Hillsborough County and 1 in Pasco County. And this is where it gets interesting. The FBI was able to definitively link Long's car to both of the victims, based on those red carpet fibers, along with other evidence. So the Hillsborough County State Attorney's Office and the Public Defender's Office, they worked out an agreement. Long agreed to a plea bargain.
A plea bargain, meaning he admitted guilt to avoid going to trial? What was the thinking behind that?
Well, I think there were a few reasons. For the prosecution, it meant guaranteed convictions for multiple very serious crimes. And it also meant that the victims' families wouldn't have to go through a long and painful trial.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what did Long gain from the deal?
He got to avoid the death penalty for 7 of the murders. Instead, he got 26 life sentences without the possibility of parole. 2 of those were to run consecutively, meaning back-to-back. He also received 7 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 25 years. But the state could still pursue the death penalty for the murder of Michelle Sims.
So it sounds like it was a strategic move for both sides, balancing justice for the victims with some measure of leniency for Long. But even with the deal, the possibility of the death penalty was still very real.
Absolutely. In July 1986, he was found guilty of Michelle Sims's murder and sentenced to death.
It's a tangled web of legal proceedings, a delicate balance between punishment and due process. But the story, as we know, doesn't end there.
Nope. There were a lot of appeals and legal challenges to come, dragging the case out for decades.
While those legal battles were going on, there was another story unfolding.
Yeah, a story of incredible resilience and advocacy.
You're talking about Lisa McVeigh.
I am.
Her story doesn't just end with her abduction.
Not at all. She came out of that experience with incredible strength. She became a powerful advocate for victims' rights, working with law enforcement, sharing her story, and helping to train officers to better support survivors of trauma.
It's truly inspiring how she turned her pain into a way to help others.
Absolutely. She refused to be defined by what happened to her. Instead, she used it as a force for positive change.
So in this first part of our deep dive into the case of Bobby Joe Long, we've explored his horrific crimes, his trial and sentencing, and the remarkable story of Lisa McVeigh's survival and advocacy. But there's still more to uncover.
Definitely.
Legal battles to untangle. A legacy to dissect. This case really touches on so many different aspects of society, from criminal psychology to the evolution of forensic science.
You said it's like a window into human behavior, law enforcement, scientific advancements, and as we continue our deep dive, we'll uncover even more intriguing details about this case and its impact on the world of forensic science and the Tampa Bay community.
I can't wait. We left off talking about Long's plea bargain and that he instantly ended up on death row. But like you said, that wasn't the end of his legal journey. He went through a whole bunch of appeals, right? It's wild to think that even after a plea deal, a case can drag on in the courts for so long.
Yeah, it's a long and complex process, especially with these high-profile cases. Appeals are important, but they can definitely take time. I know that Long appealed both the murder convictions and the death sentence for those Hillsborough County crimes, and there was one appeal in particular focused on the murder of Virginia Johnson.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that. What was it about her case that was different from the others?
Honestly, without access to all the legal documents, it's tough to say for sure what the arguments were. What we do know is that his death sentence for Virginia Johnson's murder, that was actually vacated. His conviction was reversed, and the case went back to the trial court. They were even directed to acquit him of that specific murder.
Wow, an acquittal. That's a pretty big turn of events. I wonder what kind of evidence or legal strategy his defense team used to get that outcome. It really makes you think about how hard it must be to overturn a conviction.
It definitely highlights all the intricacies of the legal system. Even when you have a confession and what seems like a mountain of evidence, there can still be these unexpected twists and turns. But even with that acquittal, it's important to remember that he was still convicted of 8 other murders, a truly horrific crime spree.
Absolutely, that's something we can't forget. So after that appeal, did he keep fighting his other convictions and sentences? What ultimately happened to him?
So even though that one conviction was overturned, he stayed on death row because of the others. There were legal challenges and appeals that went on for over 30 years, but none of them were successful in getting those other convictions or death sentences overturned.
30 years? That's a long time to be on death row. Living with that kind of uncertainty must be incredibly tough.
I can't even imagine.
It definitely makes you think about capital punishment, the death penalty, all the moral and ethical questions that come with it.
Right. It's a huge debate, and there are strong arguments on both sides. Some people see it as justified for certain crimes, while others see it as cruel and unusual, no matter what.
And that debate will probably continue for a long time. But in Long's case, there was a definitive end to his story.
That's right. In 2019, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Long's death warrant. That was actually the first death warrant DeSantis had signed since taking office. So after all the appeals were denied, Long was executed by lethal injection on May 23, 2019, bringing a close to this long and complicated case.
A somber end to a dark chapter. It's interesting how Lisa McVeigh's story kind of weaves its way through all of this. We talked about her strength and resilience, how she turned such a horrific experience into something positive. She didn't just survive, she really thrived.
Yeah, it's remarkable. She took control of her narrative. She became an advocate, working with law enforcement to help other survivors. She even served as a deputy sheriff, using her experience to make a real difference.
That's powerful. She really turned her pain into purpose. I know her story was even turned into a Lifetime movie, believe me, The Abduction of Lisa McVeigh.
That's right. That movie brought her story to an even wider audience. It really highlighted the incredible courage she showed, both during her ordeal and in the years after.
It's a story that sticks with you, for sure. But as we're thinking about Lisa McVeigh and her incredible journey, it's also important to remember the other women whose lives were tragically cut short. Long was connected to the deaths of at least 10 women. And each one of those women represents a life full of dreams, hopes, and loved ones left behind.
Absolutely. While we celebrate Lisa McVeigh's survival and her incredible work, we can't forget the devastating impact Long had on all of his victims and their families. Each life lost is a profound tragedy, and it's important to honor their memory by continuing to search for justice and understanding.
You're right, it's easy to get caught up in the legal details and the more sensational aspects of a case. But at the end of the day, it's about the human cost. These were real people, and their stories deserve to be remembered.
I agree. And it's not just about remembering the victims, it's also about learning from these tragedies and doing what we can to prevent them from happening again.
That's a really good point. We talked about the crimes, the investigation, the trial, the appeals, even the execution. But what can we take away from all of this? What are the broader lessons that we can learn from the case of Bobby Joe Long?
Well, I think one of the most obvious lessons is the importance of forensic science. Like we talked about earlier, those red carpet fibers were absolutely crucial. They help to connect Long to the crimes, and it shows just how important it is to keep advancing forensic technology and to make sure investigators have the training and resources they need to gather and analyze evidence.
Right, like even the smallest clue can be the key to solving a case.
Exactly. And beyond the science, there's also a lesson about awareness and prevention. Long's case, with his classified ad tactic, it reminds us to be careful, especially in situations where we might be vulnerable.
It's about trusting your gut feeling and being cautious, especially around strangers.
Exactly.
But beyond individual vigilance, what can we do as a society to address the underlying causes of violence? What can we do to prevent tragedies like this from happening in the first place?
That's a tough question, and there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with addressing things like poverty, mental health issues, and lack of resources. All these things can contribute to crime and violence. It's about creating a society where everyone has opportunities and support.
Right, it's a big task. It requires everyone to work together, individuals, communities, institutions.
Yeah, it's a team effort. It's about understanding that preventing crime goes beyond just law enforcement. It's about creating a strong and supportive social fabric where everyone feels valued and has a chance to succeed.
That's a great point. So far in our deep dive, we've really covered a lot. We've gone through the horrifying details of Long's crimes, the complex legal battles that followed, and the incredible story of Lisa McVeigh's survival and advocacy. It's a case that has so many layers, touching on everything from the criminal justice system to the power of forensic science. But before we wrap things up, there's one more area I want to explore. We've mentioned how important forensic science was in this case, and how those red carpet fibers were so crucial. But I'd love to learn more about that aspect. How did this case, along with others like it, contribute to the advancement of forensic science, especially when it comes to fiber analysis? It's pretty amazing to think about it. A tiny little fiber can be the key to solving a big crime. It's like something you'd see on TV.
I know, right? But that's often how it goes in real life, too. Forensic science is all about the details. Long's case, and some others around the same time, they really put fiber analysis on the map. Back then, DNA testing wasn't as advanced or common as it is now, so investigators really relied on trace evidence, like fibers and hair and things like that, to connect suspects to the crime scene.
So you're saying those little red fibers they found on the victims, those were a game changer in this whole thing.
Absolutely. It wasn't like they found a bloody weapon or anything obvious. It was these microscopic fibers that you could easily miss if you weren't careful. But those fibers, when they matched them to the carpet in Long's car, that was a huge link, putting him right there at the scene.
It makes you realize how important it is for them to collect all that evidence, no matter how small.
Exactly. Long's case was a wake-up call for law enforcement. It showed them that they needed to be Really meticulous. They needed specialized training in collecting and analyzing evidence, and they needed to invest in new technology like microscopes and things to really be able to analyze these tiny pieces of evidence.
So in a way, even though it's a horrible thing to say, this case actually helped push forensic science forward. It's kind of a bittersweet legacy, but those advancements have probably helped solve a lot of other crimes.
It is a strange thing to think about, but yeah, sometimes good things come out of bad situations, and the things they learned from Long's case, they're still benefiting us today.
It's a reminder that knowledge is power. Even when something terrible happens, we can still learn and grow from it. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, beyond the impact on forensics, what other lessons do you think we can take away from this? What can we do as individuals and as a society to try to prevent things like this from happening again?
That's a big question, but an important one. I think, first of all, we need to keep supporting and advancing forensic science. Technology is always changing, and criminals are always coming up with new ways to hide their tracks. We need to make sure law enforcement has the tools and the training to stay ahead of the game.
Right, it's like an arms race.
Exactly. And second, I think we need to create a culture of awareness and vigilance. We all have a responsibility to be aware of our surroundings, to report anything suspicious, and to support victims of violence.
It's about looking out for ourselves and each other. We can't just expect the police to handle everything. We need to be proactive.
Definitely. And lastly, I think it's really important to understand the factors that lead to violent behavior. We need to address things like mental health, substance abuse, and social inequality. We need a society that focuses on preventing violence, not just reacting to it.
Right, it's about creating a world where everyone has the support and opportunities they need.
Exactly.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored this really dark case of Bobby Joe Long, and we've talked about the impact his crimes had on so many people, the legal battles, the advancements in forensic science, and the inspiring story of Lisa McVeigh. It's a case that really shows the complexities of our justice system and the importance of always seeking the truth.
It has been a journey, for sure. From the horrific details of the crimes to the fight for justice, and through it all, we see the incredible strength and resilience of the human spirit.
It leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it?
It does. Going back to your question earlier about how Lisa McVeigh was able to not only survive, but to dedicate her life to helping others, it really shows us that even in the darkest of times, hope and healing are possible, and that we all have the power to make a positive difference in the world.
It's a great point. That's a really good note to end on. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on this deep dive into the case of Bobby Joe Long. We'll be back soon with another fascinating case to explore. Until then, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.